A 6-month-old child was placed inside a grave beside the dead. The burial was sealed with stones and skins, but some researchers have suggested the child may not have been dead yet. The discovery happened in 1972 on the remote western coast of Greenland. Two brothers, Hans and Joachim Gronvold, were hunting birds along the rocky shoreline near an abandoned Inuit settlement called Qilakitsoq. While moving beneath a steep cliff, they noticed stones arranged inside a narrow crevice in the rock. Curious, they moved closer. Inside the crevice lay human bodies, not 1 or 2, but 8. The dead had been placed deliberately in the shelter of the rock and covered with skins and stones. The narrow opening allowed cold, dry Arctic air to circulate constantly, while the cliff above protected the grave from sunlight and animals. Over centuries, those conditions preserved the bodies almost perfectly. The location itself seemed designed to hide them. Qilakitsoq roughly translates as the place with little sky, a fitting name for a burial tucked deep beneath the shadow of stone. When archaeologists examined the grave, they realized the bodies had been arranged carefully on a bedding of grass and wrapped in layers of fur clothing and sealskins. Some of the women had even been placed in a seated position, supported upright by the surrounding skins. Nearby, a second small cluster of bodies suggested that 2 closely connected burial groups had been placed within the crevice. The people buried there belonged to the Thule culture, ancestors of modern Inuit communities. Radiocarbon dating placed the burial around 1475 CE, nearly 5 centuries before the hunters stumbled upon it. But the most striking discovery was the condition of the bodies themselves. The cold Arctic environment had naturally mummified them. Facial features remained visible. 5 of the women still carried traditional tattoo markings across their faces. Even their clothing survived in remarkable detail. Feather-lined garments, layered trousers, and waterproof boots carefully sewn from sealskin. In total, archaeologists documented 78 pieces of clothing among the 8 individuals. Whoever placed the dead here had taken time to prepare them with care. Yet the group itself was unusual. Among the 8 bodies were 6 adult women, ranging roughly from their 20s to about 50 years old, along with a young child about 4 years old and an infant only a few months old. Later, genetic studies showed that some of the individuals were related, possibly members of 2 families. But even that discovery failed to explain the most basic question: why so many women had been buried together in the first place. No clear sign of epidemic disease appeared in the remains. No evidence of violent trauma was found. And then there was the youngest body. The infant, about 6 months old, showed no obvious illness or injury. But the child had been buried alongside the others in exactly the same careful way, wrapped and placed within the grave. This raised a troubling possibility. If the mother had died first, the infant would have had little chance of survival in the Arctic environment. Without someone able to nurse the child, starvation would come quickly. Some researchers have suggested that in such desperate circumstances, communities may have chosen to end the child's life, rather than allow it to suffer a slower death. It is impossible to know whether that happened here. The remains offer no clear explanation, only the quiet possibility that the youngest person buried there may have still been alive when the stones were placed above them. What the burial at Qilakitsoq preserves is not only a moment of death, but a glimpse into the difficult choices people sometimes faced in a world where survival itself could never be taken for granted. But in Norway, archaeologists would uncover a grave that was opened again and again across generations. Someone reopened a grave that had been sealed for 100 years. Inside was a warrior's boat burial, and another body was placed inside the same grave. Archaeologists uncovered the site near the small community of Vinjora in central Norway. The discovery came during excavations connected to construction along the E39 highway, where researchers began investigating what appeared to be an ancient burial mound at a place called Skeiet. At first, the mound seemed like many others found across Scandinavia. Boat burials were a well-known practice in the Viking world, often reserved for people of high status. When archaeologists began to excavate the grave, they found the remains of a long wooden boat nearly 10 meters in length. Inside lay the first burial. The skeleton belonged to a man, placed in the vessel along with weapons that marked him as a warrior. A sword, a spear, and a shield had been arranged beside him, suggesting that the burial likely dated to the late 8th century, during the final centuries before the Viking Age reached its height. Graves like this were not meant to be disturbed. Once the burial was completed, the mound above it would have sealed the grave, marking it as a place of memory for the community that lived nearby. Yet something unusual had happened here. Roughly a century after the man had been buried, the mound was opened again. Whoever returned to the grave appears to have known where to dig. The mound was carefully excavated until the earlier burial was exposed. But instead of removing the warrior or disturbing his remains, the people performing the second burial did something far stranger. They placed another boat inside the grave. The second vessel was smaller than the first, about 7 or 8 meters long. Inside it lay the skeleton of a woman, buried with objects that suggested she too had held an important place in her community. Archaeologists found large gilded brooches, a necklace of glass beads, scissors, a spindle whorl used for spinning thread, and a decorated harness fitting that had been repurposed as jewelry. The head of a cow had also been placed in the grave as part of the ritual offering. The most remarkable detail, however, was the position of the boats themselves. The smaller boat had been carefully placed within the larger one so that the two vessels rested together inside the same grave. One burial enclosed within another, separated by nearly 100 years. To accomplish this, the people who reopened the mound would have needed to remember the location of the earlier grave and deliberately return to it long after the first burial had taken place. The warrior's remains were left undisturbed. Instead, the woman was buried beside him, her boat nested inside the older vessel. Why this was done remains uncertain. One possibility is that the woman was related to the earlier warrior, perhaps a descendant who was meant to share the burial place of an important ancestor. In societies where family lineage determined power and status, burial beside a respected predecessor could reinforce claims to land or authority. Another explanation points to the role of ancestors in Norse belief systems. The dead were not always considered distant or forgotten. In some traditions, they remained connected to the living community, their graves sometimes becoming places connected to memory and identity within the landscape. If that was the case, reopening the mound may not have been seen as disturbing the dead at all. Instead, it may have been understood as joining the living and the dead across generations. But the truth behind the burial at Skeiet is still unknown. The two individuals remained together in the same grave, their lives separated by a century, but their final resting place deliberately shared. Long before Viking warriors were buried in Norway, humans were already laying their dead to rest in ways that still puzzle archaeologists today. 28,000 years ago, someone buried a child. Not hastily, not as if they were simply disposing of a body. The grave had been prepared. Red pigment surrounded the remains. Small shell ornaments had been placed beside the body. The child appears to have been wrapped carefully before being laid in the ground. Why would people living in the harsh world of the Ice Age devote such care to the burial of a 4-year-old? The remains were discovered in Portugal's Lapedo Valley, at a rock shelter known as Lagar Velho. In 1998, archaeologists excavating the site uncovered an unusual patch of sediment stained with red ochre. As the soil was carefully removed, the outline of a small skeleton slowly appeared beneath the surface. The bones belonged to a child who had died at around 4 years of age, during the Upper Paleolithic roughly 28,000 years ago. The remains were remarkably well preserved. The skeleton lay deliberately placed within a shallow grave. Traces of red ochre pigment stained both the bones and the surrounding soil, suggesting that the body had been covered with the pigment as part of the burial ritual. Nearby, archaeologists found perforated shell ornaments, small objects that had been intentionally modified and may once have been sewn onto clothing or worn as decoration before being placed in the grave. There are also signs that the child may have been wrapped in animal skin before burial. Taken together, these details show that the preparation was deliberate and careful. The effort required time and intention. It also raises a deeper question about life in the Ice Age. The people living in this region were hunter-gatherers surviving in a cold and unpredictable environment. Daily life revolved around finding food, moving across the landscape, and enduring a climate far harsher than modern Europe. Yet even under those conditions, people took time to prepare a ceremonial burial for a child. Why? One possible answer lies in something deeply human, the instinct to mourn. But the skeleton itself introduced another puzzle. When researchers studied the bones more closely, they noticed features that did not fit neatly into expectations. Some traits appeared consistent with modern humans, while others resembled characteristics often associated with Neanderthals. This unusual combination sparked debate among scientists. Some researchers suggested the child might represent a population where Neanderthals and modern humans had interbred, leaving traces of both lineages in the skeleton. Others argue that the bones fall within the natural variation of early modern humans and do not necessarily indicate mixed ancestry. Even now, researchers cannot fully agree on how to interpret those features. What remains undeniable is the burial itself. Long before cities, agriculture, or written history, someone stood in this small rock shelter in Portugal and prepared a grave. They placed ornaments beside the body. They covered the child with red pigment. Even in the deep Ice Age, people were already expressing something we still recognize today: the need to mourn their dead. But in another part of the world, people would take the treatment of the dead even further, preserving bodies long after death itself. Thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt, people on the Pacific coast of South America were already turning their dead into mummies. But their method was far stranger. Bodies were opened, bones reinforced with sticks, faces rebuilt with clay. Why would a prehistoric fishing culture reconstruct the bodies of their dead? Along the barren coastline of the Atacama Desert, in what is now northern Chile and southern Peru, archaeologists uncovered one of the oldest mummification traditions in the world. Today, the region is known as one of the driest places on Earth. Rain is rare, and the desert preserves organic material with unusual clarity. Thousands of years ago, small communities lived along this coast. Archaeologists call them the Chinchorro culture. They were not kings, priests, or rulers. They were fishermen and gatherers, living from the rich waters of the Pacific. Their lives revolved around the sea, harpoons, nets, and simple coastal settlements built near the shore. Yet these communities developed one of the most extraordinary mortuary traditions ever discovered. The first scientific description of these mummies came in 1917, when the German archaeologist Max Uhle excavated burials near Arica, Chile. At first, the preserved bodies seemed similar to other naturally mummified remains found in the Atacama Desert. The extreme dryness of the region can preserve human bodies without any intervention. But as more discoveries were made, archaeologists began to notice something unexpected. These bodies had not simply dried in the desert. They had been deliberately transformed. The Chinchorro were not simply preserving their dead. They were reconstructing them. In the earliest and most elaborate type, known as the Black Mummies, dating to around 5000 BCE, the process was astonishingly complex. The body was first carefully opened. Internal organs and muscles were removed. The skeleton was then reinforced with thin wooden sticks to support the structure. After that, the body was reconstructed. The remaining skin might be replaced or covered, as the body was rebuilt using clay, plant fibers, and ash. The face was carefully modeled again, sometimes with a mask-like surface shaped to resemble human features. Finally, the entire figure was coated with a dark pigment made from manganese, giving the mummy its black appearance. Later, Chinchorro mummies, known as red mummies, followed a somewhat different method. Instead of dismantling the body completely, the torso was opened to remove internal organs. The body was then filled and restored before being painted with red ochre. A wig of human hair was often added, and the face was finished with a clay mask. Every stage required time, skill, and deliberate effort. And the most surprising detail is not the complexity of the process, but who received it. In many ancient societies, elaborate burials were reserved for rulers or elites. Egyptian mummification, for example, was strongly connected to wealth and social status. The Chinchorro were different. Their mummification practices were applied to everyone: men, women, children. Archaeologists have even found mummified infants and fetuses. For a small coastal culture living thousands of years before written history, this level of care is remarkable. Rebuilding a body in this way could take days, yet it was performed repeatedly, generation after generation. Why? One possible explanation comes from the harsh realities of life along this ancient coastline. Studies of Chinchorro settlements suggest that infant mortality was extremely high. Some researchers believe the water sources in the region may have contained elevated levels of arsenic, a naturally occurring element that can increase miscarriages and infant deaths. If so, families may have experienced repeated loss. In such circumstances, the careful reconstruction of the dead may have been a way to confront grief, to keep the presence of loved ones within the community rather than allowing them to disappear. But this interpretation remains a hypothesis. Another possibility is that the Chinchorro saw the dead not as beings who had fully departed, but as ancestors who continued to exist alongside the living. Some archaeologists believe the mummies may have remained visible within settlements for a time before their final burial, perhaps participating in rituals or serving as a physical reminder of lineage and identity. If that is true, then these reconstructed bodies were not simply remains. They were members of the community who had crossed into another state of existence. Whatever the explanation, the Chinchorro practice continued for thousands of years. Over time, the methods evolved, becoming less elaborate, but the essential idea remained. The dead could be preserved, reshaped, and returned to a recognizable human form. In another burial ground discovered thousands of kilometers away, archaeologists found something far more unsettling. Skeletons carefully buried, yet missing one crucial part of the body. At first, the cemetery looked ordinary, but as archaeologists uncovered more graves, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Many of the men buried there had been decapitated. The discovery was made in the city of York, at a site known as Driffield Terrace. Between 2004 and 2005, excavations revealed a Roman burial ground dating roughly between the 2nd and 4th centuries CE. In total, archaeologists uncovered more than 80 graves. At first glance, the burials seemed typical of the Roman period in Britain. The bodies had been carefully placed in individual graves, laid out in an orderly cemetery. But a closer look revealed something deeply unusual. Many of the skeletons were missing their heads. In grave after grave, the same pattern appeared. The bodies had been buried normally, but the skulls had been removed and placed elsewhere in the grave. In several cases, the heads were positioned between the legs of the deceased. In others, they rested beside the torso or near the feet. The arrangement did not appear random. Whoever buried these men had placed the skulls deliberately. Cut marks on the neck vertebrae confirmed that many of the heads had been removed by decapitation. In some skeletons, the cuts suggested a single powerful blow. In others, the marks hinted at a more difficult execution, where the blade had struck more than once before severing the head. The cemetery quickly became one of the most puzzling Roman burial sites ever discovered in Britain. Another detail made the mystery even stranger. The graves contained almost exclusively men. Only a handful of children and just one adult woman were identified among the remains. This was not a typical community cemetery where families were buried together. Instead, it seemed to contain a very specific group of people. The skeletons themselves offered further clues. Many showed signs of hard, physically demanding lives. Bones revealed healed fractures, damaged ribs, and injuries consistent with repeated combat or heavy labor. Some skulls showed old wounds that had healed long before death. These men had clearly endured violence during their lives. Scientific analysis added another layer to the story. Isotope studies of the teeth revealed that several of the individuals had not grown up in Britain. Their early lives may have begun in distant parts of the Roman world, perhaps continental Europe or even regions closer to the eastern Mediterranean. At some point, they had been brought to Roman Britain, where they eventually died and were buried in this unusual cemetery. In the Roman world, decapitation was a known method of execution. Criminals and prisoners could be put to death by a sword stroke to the neck. The cut marks on some of the skeletons matched the kind of injuries expected from such executions. Yet the cemetery does not fully fit that explanation. Executed criminals were rarely buried with such care. At Driffield Terrace, the bodies were placed in proper graves. Some were accompanied by small grave goods, including pottery vessels and animal bones. The positioning of the bodies appears deliberate, almost respectful. Whoever buried these men took the time to arrange them carefully. If these were executions, why treat the dead with such attention? Another theory suggests that some of the men may have been gladiators or arena fighters. Their strong bones and evidence of repeated injuries could fit lives spent in combat. And one skeleton revealed a startling detail: wounds that appear consistent with the bite of a large animal, possibly a lion. Such injuries may point to combat spectacles in which humans fought wild beasts, events known from Roman arenas across the empire. But even this explanation does not solve every part of the puzzle. No clear arena structure has been identified near the cemetery, and not all of the skeletons show injuries typical of gladiatorial combat. So the identities of the men buried here remain uncertain. They may have been soldiers, prisoners, gladiators, or victims of some other form of punishment, now lost to history. What is clear is that something unusual was happening in this Roman community. A group of men, many of them outsiders, died violent deaths and were buried in a cemetery where decapitation became the defining feature of the graves. Nearly 2,000 years later, the reason for these strange burials is still debated. Even in the well-documented world of Rome, some mysteries remain stubbornly unexplained. And yet elsewhere, archaeologists uncovered a grave that raised a quieter question. Why were two people buried reaching for each other? Nearly 2,000 years ago, someone in Roman Britain buried two men in the same grave. Their bodies were placed carefully side by side. Their hands were touching. Archaeologists still don't know why. The grave was uncovered during excavations outside the Roman city of Eboracum, known today as York. Most of the burials in this cemetery date between the 2nd and 4th centuries CE, during the height of Roman rule in Britain. The site contained dozens of graves, most belonging to young adult men. Several skeletons showed healed injuries and signs of violent trauma, while others had been buried in ways that immediately caught the attention of researchers. But one grave stood apart from the rest. Unlike most of the other burials, this grave contained two bodies placed together. Inside it lay two adult males arranged deliberately within a single grave pit. Their bodies had been positioned next to one another with clear intention. One detail was especially striking. Their hands had been placed so that they rested together. At first glance, the discovery seemed to offer a simple explanation. When news of the burial reached the public, many assumed archaeologists had discovered the grave of two ancient lovers. Archaeology rarely confirms stories that neatly. Detailed analysis of the skeletons showed that both individuals were biologically male and of similar age. Beyond that, however, the evidence grows frustratingly silent. No inscription named them. No grave marker explained their relationship. No surviving Roman record described who they were. In Roman cemeteries, adults were usually buried individually, with inscriptions identifying family ties or social status. All archaeologists can see is the arrangement the mourners left behind. The placement of the bodies appears intentional. Their hands were not scattered randomly, as bones sometimes become after centuries in the ground, but had been placed together from the beginning. The problem is that the evidence stops there. Were they relatives, perhaps brothers who died close together in time? Were they companions whose lives had been closely connected? Could they have been soldiers or travelers whose shared experiences led the people who buried them to place them side by side? Each explanation is possible. None can be proven. The Roman world produced an enormous amount of written history. Names of soldiers were carved into stone. Families recorded their dead in inscriptions and epitaphs. Entire lives and relationships were sometimes preserved in just a few lines of Latin text. Nothing remains except the quiet gesture preserved in the grave itself. Two men, one grave, hands placed side by side in the earth. Whatever the relationship between them was, the people who buried them clearly believed it mattered enough to be remembered in the way the grave was arranged. Whoever placed the two men in that grave clearly intended the gesture to matter. The problem is that the reason behind it vanished long ago. Nearly 1,000 years later, another burial ground would confront archaeologists with a very different mystery. Construction workers digging beneath a London square uncovered rows of skeletons buried deep below the city. The bodies had been placed carefully, one beside another, inside long trenches cut into the ground. The The graves looked strangely orderly, yet they were dug during the Black Death. The discovery was made in 2013 during construction work for London's Crossrail railway project. Archaeologists examining the site soon realized that the skeletons were not isolated burials. As excavation continued, the outlines of long burial trenches began to appear beneath the soil. Inside them, bodies had been placed side by side in organized rows. In some places, the dead were placed in layers as the trenches gradually filled, suggesting that the burial trenches were reopened repeatedly as new victims were brought to the cemetery. The burial ground lies in what is now Charterhouse Square Black Death Cemetery. In the 14th century, this area stood just outside the medieval city walls. Historical records suggest the land was acquired and consecrated when the city's existing graveyards could no longer cope with the number of deaths. In 1348, the Black Death reached London. The disease spread quickly through the crowded city. Within months, mortality rose to levels that overwhelmed normal burial practices. Churches and parish cemeteries filled rapidly, forcing authorities to establish emergency burial grounds where large numbers of victims could be interred. Yet the graves uncovered beneath Charterhouse Square reveal something unexpected about how those burials were carried out. Despite the scale of the disaster, the bodies were not thrown randomly into pits. The trenches show evidence of careful placement. Individuals were aligned beside one another, their bodies positioned deliberately rather than scattered. Some of the dead were placed in coffins, while others were laid directly into the trench before being covered with soil. The pattern suggests the cemetery operated as an organized system rather than a desperate dumping ground. Workers appear to have returned repeatedly, opening sections of the trench to place new victims before sealing the graves again. Scientific analysis of the skeletons later confirmed the cause of death. DNA recovered from the teeth of several individuals revealed the presence of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death. The cemetery uncovered during construction represents only a small part of the wider tragedy. Historians estimate that the plague killed perhaps 40 to 60% of London's population within a few years. Thousands of victims would have been buried across the city in churchyards and emergency cemeteries that now lie beneath modern streets. What the graves beneath Charterhouse Square reveal is not simply the scale of the epidemic, but how people responded to it. Even as death spread faster than the city could handle, those responsible for the burials continued to arrange the dead with a degree of order and care. Rows of bodies placed beside one another, covered with earth before the next victims arrived. The trenches beneath London suggest something that appears again and again in human history. Even in moments of catastrophe, people still try to bury their dead with dignity. Some bodies were rebuilt and preserved. Others were buried without their heads. Some graves held two people whose connection we can no longer explain. Even during one of history's deadliest pandemics, the victims were still buried with care. Different customs, different meanings. But every burial leaves behind the same question: what did the living believe happened after death? If one of these stories stayed with you, let it travel. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't. The search continues here on RiddleMeThis Mysteries.